The fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran, set to expire this week, is under pressure this morning amid renewed threats, escalatory actions, and a continued standoff over the Strait of Hormuz. Over the past 72 hours, both warring parties have repeatedly accused each other of violating the tenuous truce. The latest back and forth began Friday morning when Iran announced the strait would reopen. President Trump, however, said the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports would remain in place until a deal is reached. So Iran then, in return, said it would once again enforce restrictions over the waterway. And on Saturday, it fired on 2 Indian-flagged ships trying to transit. President Trump described that action as a, quote, total violation of our ceasefire, reiterated his threat to knock out, quote, every single power plant and bridge in Iran. Those are potential war crimes targeting civilian sites. And he said he'd do it if the country doesn't come to a deal. Then, in the latest test of the truce, the president announced yesterday that the U.S. military attacked and seized an Iranian cargo ship it said was attempting to get past the American blockade of Iran's ports and coastline. Trump said a U.S. Navy-guided missile destroyer in the Gulf of Oman warned the ship to stop before, quote, blowing a hole in the engine room when it didn't listen. Tehran is now warning it will respond to and retaliate against what it calls a violation of the ceasefire and an act of piracy. So all of that means it's unclear if the talks between the U.S. and Iran are actually going to happen today, following the seizure of that Iranian-flagged ship by U.S. forces. A spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry has said that Iran has no plans for another round of negotiations with the U.S. However, the New York Times reports that Pakistan's capital has been put on security lockdown. That's the same procedure that was taken when the city hosted the previous round of these talks. President Trump also told MS Now that envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were set to lead the U.S. delegation for the latest round of these talks, before 2 senior officials later said Vice President J.D. Vance would actually be the one to lead it. Unclear. The White House didn't explain the contradiction, so we don't know who's going or if they even have anything to go to, but it tees us up nicely for staff writer at The Atlantic, covering national security and the Defense Department, Nancy Youssef, here on set with me. Okay, so I guess the ultimate question is, do you think they do peace talks or not? Because this weekend was a real test, as we said, of a ceasefire that was already fragile, but also a ceasefire that was meant to be short-term and is coming to an end.
Yeah, it was just exhausting to listen to read everything that happened in the span of 48 hours. I think what we're seeing is a real question of trust on the Iranian side. What they're signaling is that they believe that the announcement Friday meant that the blockade would end. And when it didn't, I think their fear is that this is not a talk really intended to reach a negotiated settlement, which I think everyone agrees is the only way this really ends, but rather a repetition of what they've seen in the past, where the United States will say they want to reach a talk and then instead escalate. We saw this last June and again in February. So I think they're not intending to say we don't actually trust the process. Now, having said all that, the last talk a week ago, they didn't show up until the last minute. So it's hard to say definitively that they will or will not be there. But at the minimum, they are saying we're uncomfortable with how these talks are going so far and the lack of trust that they've developed, again, from the last talk until now.
Do you think from an output perspective, it matters whether J.D. Vance is leading the delegation or not? I mean, it's interesting to those of us here who like to look at who's up and who's down in the Trump administration, because that ends up showing up in the policy. But from an output perspective, do you think it matters?
I wonder if the Iranians said we're not going to show up at all if J.D. Vance isn't there. They have said that they don't trust Witkoff and Kushner because of those past talks and the breach that happened. I also think it's a calculation by the Iranians because for them, they see the vice president being there, that they were able to sort of leverage that sort of say over who was part of the U.S. delegation. They see him as a future presidential candidate. So I think their hope is that he has more incentive to reach an agreement. And if he is elected, from their perspective, more likely to hold on to it. Moreover, he is very well known to have opposed the start of this conflict to begin with. So I can't tell how much of this is a negotiation tactic on their part or a true belief that the best prospect of a negotiated settlement happens through the vice president, not through Witkoff and Kushner. Now, having said all that, to your point, I think the president has more trust in Kushner and Witkoff, which is why we heard in those initial comments yesterday, that I was just thinking, was it just yesterday, that J.D. Vance wasn't going before we quickly saw, as you noted, a change in that position.
I think that is fascinating. I'm always interested in who is at the table, because if you are given the power to speak on behalf of this particular president, it means that he has a trust in you. And I think that percolates in other areas of policy. And so for Vance, I think it's going to be interesting, A, if he goes. The fact that the president was the one who told our colleague Jackie Alamany, no, Vance is not going to be there for security reasons. And then senior administration officials pretty immediately walked that back and said, no, he's going to go. He's going to lead the delegation. That's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out, of course, if there are talks at all. But then there's also the administration's strategy. And this has been true throughout this and other conflicts. The president is always threatening to say, well, I'll get more intense. I will do more. I will escalate more. I will show you more the might of the American military. But does more escalation get you closer to what he wants, which is a non-nuclear Iran and some kind of agreement that ends this conflict that he started?
It's a great question because, as you noted in the opening, he's talked about hitting civilian infrastructure, which, while they can be targeted if they're dual use, if they are truly a civilian target and it's established as such, is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. But you're getting at an important point where we keep seeing the president use military tactics or the threat of escalatory military tactics to try to achieve a strategic aim, but one doesn't lead to the other. You know, if the U.S. were to escalate its strikes on Iran, I would just note that the Iranian regime has endured an aggressive 38-day, 39-day campaign of U.S. strikes. The risk is that they become inured to them and that there's a diminishing return for them because of that. So that threat in and of itself doesn't necessarily guarantee anything, nor does it get what the president's ultimately seeking, which is the strategic outcome. We haven't had that clearly spelled out. How much of this is now a war about regime change? How much is it about reopening the strait? More strikes doesn't answer that question.
Yeah, and also more strikes, for all the reasons that you mentioned, might not get him where he's going, but it also risks further alienating our allies on the world stage and threatening the worldview that countries have of the United States. All of that part and parcel.
That's right. And I'll add real quickly, I think we're at a point now where we have to now think about this as the messy ending that this was always going to be, that we no longer need to think about this as a conflict that ends in a matter of days or over one negotiation period, but potentially over a protracted period. And that's the rhetoric that we saw over the weekend, I think, foreshadow what we're going to see in the coming days and probably weeks.
And I think that fear of a protracted conflict is also now starting to show up in the polls, because there are new polls that show President Trump's approval rating sinking as Americans express growing concern about this war in Iran. The latest NBC News poll has Trump's approval at 37%. That's the lowest of his second term. 63% disapprove. The poll finds 2/3 of Americans disapprove of Trump's handling of the war with Iran, including 54% who strongly disapprove. It all comes as voters say the economy remains their top concern. Still in this same poll, 29% say it's the issue that matters most to them right now. 24% said threats to democracy is most important. 12% said health care, and 10% said crime and safety. Meanwhile, President Trump on Friday repeated his false claim that he has ended 8 wars and suggested he could soon get credit for 2 more.
Iran was the bully of the Middle East. They're not the bully anymore. With the help of everyone here today, this has been by far the most successful first year of any administration in the history of our country, acknowledged by everybody. To begin with, I ended 8 wars, and it may be a little early to say this, but if we add Iran and Lebanon, that will be 10 wars ended and many, many millions of lives saved. Think of how many lives we've saved.
Do you get credit for ending wars that you started?
Generally, no.
Yeah.
And in this case, the war in Iran in particular, the American public is paying a tax for it. They're paying it every day at the gas pump and at the grocery store, which is something they didn't even really experience in terms of economic impact during Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it gets at there's another pressure point in all this, which is the economic one, let alone what's happening overseas, where there's already concerns in Europe about a jet fuel shortage in just a matter of weeks. And so when you talk to Trump voters, they didn't vote for a president to end wars. They voted for one to end inflation and price hikes. And that's the risk in all this. So I think that's why you're seeing the change in poll numbers, because they're not looking for a president to resolve outside conflicts or to spend military money on outside conflicts, but rather to invest in the United States and to improve the cost of living for everyday Americans. And so, no, and I think you're seeing that reflected in the polls, because It's really hitting Americans every day. This is not a war that's far away. This is one that is literally one you drive past in some ways every time you pass a gas station.
And I think that is the issue that most concerns Republican strategists that I talk to, and also the one that they are hoping, if this were to end quickly, which for all the reasons that we've laid out over the last 10 minutes is hard to see, they hope that it's an impact that could dissipate quickly.
Well, it's interesting, though. We saw from the administration this warning that this could take months to reset, which is true, because if it ended tomorrow, it's still months to restart shipping, to restart oil production, to reset the pricing, and stop what risks heading towards a global inflation. But I know politically that's the aim. I'm not sure if practically it's going to work out that way.
It is not as simple as flipping a light switch. And I think that's the important thing that all of us should remember as we try to watch the administration guide themselves to the end of this conflict. Unclear what that will look like or if it's going to happen as soon as this week. We will, of course, be watching. Staff writer at The Atlantic, Nancy Youssef, helping us make sense of a very busy 48 hours. Thank you, my friend.